Okay, so I'm going to use a student's file from class as an example, um, both to help her and any others that might be in a similar situation. So we're just starting the ball bounce up project, right? And I've got a couple QuickTime movies to show here at the very beginning, so I'll just press this one. So we're just very early on in the assignment, right? We're just trying to figure out some timing and spacing. Not as much finesse going on. But the student was working on this, and you can see I guess the issue here is all about the timing and spacing, right? I was trying to think of a way to describe this a little bit ago. I think what we're seeing here is that the ball moves along the path. We've got a motion trail in there, right? So we can see what the path is doing. So it just seems like because of where the keyframes are, it's just zipping along that. I guess the thing that I would want to, maybe a way to reframe this instead of bouncing, this is a series of jumping and falling, right? So we want it to look like the ball somehow has jumped, and then gravity takes over and it hits, right? So it falls to the ground, and then it has to jump again. The other thing, too, is you can see there's greater distances covered, like this is a little one, and then a bigger one, and a bigger one, a bigger one, and then a big one. But they all generally happen about the same spacing. They get like the length of time, right? The duration of from point to point is not quite exactly the same, but it grows just a little bit. But the amount of bounce, right, it covers a long distance here, and it's very high, much more so than this. So it should take longer, right? How much longer? I mean, I don't think I could calculate the physics of this, right? Is it a linear equation? Is an exponential thing? We're also taking the fact that the ball is trying to jump, right? So it's applying force to itself. At least that's the directive for the assignment, like how it would use squash and stretch to have some agency over trying to build up some bounce. So that's this one here. So I've taken the same file and I've done a little tweaking here. And we'll just let this loop through. So I wouldn't say this is perfect. Like, hopefully you're seeing the difference here is that it takes longer as it jumps higher just because of the distance, right, as it goes up in the air. There's a certain amount of force that it can apply to get off the ground quicker, right? It could jump harder, I guess. So there's some variation in how that would work. But gravity is going to be a constant, trying to force it down, right? So it's expending more energy and building up more energy to get up higher in the air, but it also has farther to travel, right? So, and obviously I've done some squash and stretch in here. I didn't do it at the very beginning. I wanted to do little comparisons. So there's nothing, and then there's a tiny one, and then very pronounced, right? Like it was building up energy and almost like on a trampoline, ready, boing, for its last jump. So this is the point I want to talk about how I got to this point and some standard issues. I guess the one thing I also wanted to mention here is you can see these curves. In fact, we're going to look at them in a second. They look almost like potato chips, like the edges of them, right? You can see how they're kind of curving through space. These are more, smooth, the arcs of these, and we'll talk about how I got to that. All right, so let's put these away, and let's see which file am I on. I'm on that one. So let's bring up the baseline. So this is the student file, and again, this is early on, so now there would be a lot of refinement as the student would continue to work at this, but instead of starting to finesse animation that already maybe had some problems with the timing and space, we want to try to correct that as much as possible here at the beginning. So let's start with, okay, sorry, I had to press pause there for a second. So we're looking right here at the graph editor of this, and you can see these, in fact, I'll go right here. So this first little bounce, you can see there's not much height to it, right? In this 169, 175, so it takes 6 frames to do this one. The next one is significantly higher, but it takes 175, 183, 8 frames, so 2 extra frames to go a decent chunk of distance. These two are pretty close to each other in height, right? Though it does travel a little further in the Z, I guess. And then this one's a big step up. Let's see, what's the timing here on this one? That's 10 frames. What's this one? 13, 14 frames. Right, so little changes, but I would argue just not enough. This one would be 7. So it's about half of that if this were to fall to the ground. Right, we would get, I guess, a 16 frame loop. This one's 14, this one's 10. What do we say? That one's 8, that's 6, right? So they're just pretty similar from as far as the distance, right? Or I should say the interval of time. We see it as distance, but this interval is time compared to the distance that's traveled in the y, right? So this is one thing that we're going to fix. I think that's pretty obvious, but oops. Let's go back to object mode. Sorry. Okay, so the other thing here is if I move to this top view, you can see that we'll even do, can you see how this curve, sorry, I'm using my magic mouse and it just doesn't like to work on this sometimes. I have to trick it. Right, so you can see that the ball's kind of curving through air. It definitely is there, right? So first thing is, let's address that pattern. And we'll go back to, well, maybe we'll just leave it at this view. Okay, so when it's in the air, there really shouldn't be any information on the X and the Z because it doesn't really have the ability to change direction, right? It's here, and then it jumps towards this point, and it does this by jumping towards it, and it jumps up, right? And it can't really change that trajectory to get there. So any of these points that I see that are at the top of the peak, I'm just going to delete those. Right? Anytime it's at the on the ground, right? When it's landing here, those I want to keep because I want it to obviously stay there. So let's get rid of those. And this one's on the ground. This one, these two are in the air, right? So you can see already it's gotten straighter, but it still has a little bit of a waggle in here, right? So honestly, I'm not sure if this is like the preferred method to do this, if you would just add a bunch of keyframes to try to straighten it out. But for me, as far as that distance, I'm going to use the Y to kind of control how it's moving along this path, as far as the kind of ease in and ease out, if you want to think of it that way. The others here on the X and the Z, I just find it easier to just select those, and I'll just use the ones that are part of the jumps. And I'm just going to make them linear, right? So there's the little linear tangent icon there. And you can see now it's moving in a straight line in between these spots, right? And obviously this maybe looks a little weird that's from here, but these look pretty good, right? You can see that it's moving in a straight line, and a straight line, and a straight line. I guess you could imagine it going up this way and then the wind blowing it and curving a certain way if you had an object like that, but in this case that's probably not going to happen, right? So on the X and the Z, just making those linear across that space is the way to go. All right, so let's go back to translate Y. So I could also, one thing I might suggest, obviously, is continuing to tweak these so I get more of a steepness out of this. Later on, we'll look at maybe how to add some keyframes instead of just using the tangent handles here to kind of shape it. What if I actually have if I can't get the trajectory I want out of this with the tangent handles. How might I change that? Oops, those are, let's make those a little steeper. All right, so that's a good start. Okay, so we still haven't addressed the fact that it just kind of moves at that same rate, right? We haven't changed too much of the distance here. So many different ways we could do this. I'm just going to go into this little range. All right, so let's treat this as our first little hop. It happens right here, right? This one right here. So if this is our first little jump, I'm just going to do some of this by feel. Right? So I'm going to select, if this one's about that far, this one's, what do we say, 6, and then this 8, and this is 10, and then this is 13. I'm just going to I'll just modify this a little bit. Oops. All right, so this one's got a little bit longer, maybe just a smidge too long, I don't know. Well, we'll leave it here, we'll see. So what I'm trying to do here is just a kind of eyeball method, right? I'm just playing with spacing, stretching it out, knowing that as this gets increased, I should have a greater range. Oops. Accidentally grab that. We'll see. All right, so already I feel like that's better. Right, see, it seems to just take a little bit extra time to get to each one of those. I really especially like this one. So as it comes up here, it kind of hangs. Right? So I'm going to call it, well, let's see, what I'm going to do on a couple of these is just maybe make it, well, in fact, I'm going to leave that one there, and I'll stretch this one just a smidge. All right, so we have these so they're just hitting the ground. Now I still can do a squash and stretch on these, right? So I could stretch it here, I could squash it here, and I could stretch it as it leaves the ground. But maybe on these last two bounces here, what I'm going to do is insert a keyframe to actually keep it on the ground so I can accentuate that squash and stretch, right? So how would I do that? So this is that little valley. We're on the ground here. So if I come to the time slider down here, this is frame 199. If I hold down the middle mouse button and drag it, what I'm doing is kind of like a little time warp. And if I come up and highlight controller, and I do key selected, you can see basically it's like copy and pasting those frames in there. So let's do a little fixing. So we'll go to this one. Sure they're broken. That one's right. That one needs to be flat. That one's flat. That one needs to be. All right, let's go back to all these. And because I kind of offset that by 1, I'm just going to move it over 1. All right, so I'm just kind of making room for it as I go along. So you can see it's going to hit the ground. It stays there for a couple frames. And if that was just 1 frame there, let's really kind of accentuate this one. 1, 2, maybe I'll do 3 frames. Okay. So again, right here, let's just break both of those. Let's take that one and make it steeper. And obviously this one. Okay. Right, and they're maybe a little too flat at that peak there. I don't know, I could tweak that. It's not bad. And this one, I'm not sure. Maybe it should be just a little bit longer. Let's see, what's this one? 20, it's a 9-frame interval. 22. So it's a 10-frame interval. A little, you know what, I'm going to move it over one. Need my move tool, that'll help. All right, we'll call that good. So let's see where we're getting here. Gets a little flat on that jump there. I don't like that. And it also looks like maybe these are off from each other. No, those are right. Those, oh, I see what happened. I put those new keyframes in there. You can see that some of them are not linear. So we're getting this kind of weird waggle as it moves through space, right? Again, this is going to look better. We kind of did that little magic move, copy and paste, right, to get them in there. So this is a little tough when you're doing this. It looks weird right there, right? It stops when it hits the ground. Oh, let's fix that. So we'll work backwards through the bounces. Oops. I'm going to minimize here a little bit. I don't really need to look at this in graph editor mode. Okay, so let's look at this. All right, so there was a little bit of rotation in this file, in the what the student brought in here. So you can see the little squash and stretch is a little off the direction, right? So I can use, it's the black controller right there, right? You can see it. So I can use this to kind of line up that trajectory so that when I do the squash and stretch, it's going to look like it's squashing in that direction, which is obviously very important. All right, so how to approach this. Let's go ahead and 2 frames maybe up. In fact, we'll really accentuate it here. I'm going to select both of those controllers. Because at some point I don't want it squashing and stretching, right? I want it to look like a sphere. And then it's going to come off the ground. And maybe I'll do the same thing right here. So what I'm doing is just putting the keys so that it knows when to return to the shape, right? And so in here it can start to deform, and then as it comes back up, it's going to get back to that shape right there. All right, so let's go when it's on the ground here. Let's go to the very first frame when it's on the ground. Okay, so that bottom one, we need it to stay flat. And before it leaves the ground, we can't have it stretching through the ground, right? So now we've put these little placeholders, and now we can start to do the stretching. So maybe frame before it hits. I'm going to take that one, kind of stretch it down. I'll give it a whole bunch. And I'll keyframe those. And then it hits the ground. And of course, now what I want to do is start to squash that top. Right, and it comes off the ground here. I'm going to go back, stretch that one out this way. If I want to, I could stretch that one out. I mentioned this the other day, trying to make sure that the ball stays reasonably close to the center because it's coming off the ground here. I'm going to stretch it a little bit further this way. And I'll just put those keys there. All right, so it comes down, it starts to squash. And then can you see how it's started to unwind itself? I don't want that. The frame before it leaps off, I actually want it squashed a whole bunch. Does this make sense? All right, let's shorten this a little bit. So you can see it comes down and stretches and catches its weight, and then it basically crushes until it can't take it anymore, and then there's a violent reaction the other way to push it back up in there. Right, so it really feels like a jump. All right, I'm not going to do this on all of them. This is certainly the way I would approach some of these other bounces. Get the feel of that, right? Right, and then right now you can see it's just kind of landing there. One thing, all right, so let's recap just a couple. We changed the timing. Let's go back and select this here. Right, we were changing the timing so that as the height grew, we increased the interval of time that a jump takes, right? We just did it here for the Y, but we would look at this the same thing with all of these translate keys, right? We can see where the couplets are, where they're staying hopefully flat in this place. We've talked about how to modify this little, in fact, let's go to a frame where we would need to do this. Oh, this one's not bad. Right, you can see it's landing flat, but maybe see where it is right here. If I were to do squash and stretch, it'd be stretching not in the right direction. So if you grab that little black one, it links up with it's like it's wearing a little hat, right, on there. So I'm just going to move around, just set that up so that if I were to squash and stretch, no matter what the rotation of the ball, it's going to squash and stretch in the direction that it's moving, right? So I'm not going to do anything with that. I'm just going to leave it alone. But just keep that in mind. You might have to put lots of little keyframes in there to get that to line up. In fact, we can even see here that little thing is not, see, right there. Right? So that's not so great. All right, perfect example. All right, let's come back to this. So, okay, so with that selected, I'm going to keyframe its rotate attributes. And that looks pretty good. I'm just kind of lining it up so it's, so let's see what we get here. All right, that's nice. Can you see how it's kind of moving directly through those little squash and stretch? I could tweak it if I wanted to a little bit. And sometimes you might have to just go almost frame by frame, right, to get everything to line up right. You can see that right here it's not lined up correctly, but it doesn't matter because we're not squashing and stretching it. There it starts to get maybe just a little off. And I would always go ahead and keyframe all three of those XYZ attributes anytime you make changes because of the way it's calculated, right? So that looks good. You can see it's kind of lining itself up to make that jump. Okay, so leave those there. It seemed like I was going to mention one more thing. What was that going to be? I can't seem to remember. Oh yeah, I remember. Okay, so let's go back to this. And all right, so the one thing about this jump here at the end is I really want this to explode. So you can see where it's coming off the ground, right? It's it's off the ground, but I want it to be, instead of down here, I want this to be further up in its jump. Now, there is stuff I can do. Oops, let's grab that move tool, right? Right, but then it starts to flatten out and be a little bit difficult up here. Sometimes you just need more frames, more keyframes in places. So I'm just going to select this and insert a key, and I'm going to move that up. And I can kind of tone that down. And this one here I can kind of stretch. So you can see I get it off the ground. I'll tweak just a little bit, right? So that just really explodes off the ground, right? And it doesn't get overly flat at the top. So sometimes you just need more handles, right, to get the shape that you want. I'll tune that down. Now what I'm going to just drive that in. Right, and if I need to, maybe I put another maybe I put another key right there. Right? So I still want it to have a pretty smooth shape, right? So I get an arc out of it. But now I've exhibited, there's a lot more jump. You can see how far it comes off almost the full length of the ball. So there's a real snap to it. Right? So don't be afraid to insert some keyframes. It's really easy to do, right, with whatever curve is visible. Right, maybe on this one what I want to do is insert a key, and I want this one actually to be, so it's the ball is touching the ground almost at this spot. And I'm just going to break these tangents and make that one linear. Right, so I'm just doing these little modifications to get the shape I want, because I wanted it to come down here and touch and then crush. And then when it comes off, I want it to come off the ground quicker. Right? So you can modify these. These are not things you want to do early on. These are things you want to do late in the game, right? To really get the perfect little, right? Because before the bottom of the ball was down here, and I basically extended it kind of half the length of the ball. Boy, it really has some nice snap to it now. Okay, all right, so lots of little things covered. Hopefully that makes sense. The timing and spacing, though, so important, right? And just thinking of it as a relationship, I think, is the first thing, right? As these grow, like what's the relationship to these two versus this one, right? This is definitely much higher than that, so it's much longer than that. The linear, this will save you a lot and make your curves look great, right? The trajectory of the ball, where it's bouncing. And that squash and stretch, right? You can do a whole bunch of it, but you don't need to do it when it's way up in the air. We just want it to visually look snappy right there, and that squash and stretch really helps us do that. Okay, it's just a little trick of the eye. So don't get too Play-Doh with it. I always start with thinking, well, if I'm about to head into a bounce, then, in fact, let's select those. Right, so I'm about to head into a bounce. I'll put keyframes on both the top and bottom controller and the rotate controller if you're using that to hold it in place. And then I'll go to the very end where I know I'm going to be done with the squashing and stretching, and I'll put those keyframes there. Then I'll just deal with it on the ground, right? And these are happening, one frame apart, so I'm not worried about modifying the curve. There's not much change there because they're just moving between those two keys. This one here, if I wanted to, like, You can see it gets to that flattened state a little bit quicker. See that little bit where it just like it can't hold on anymore, and then the next shape is off the ground. That's pretty fun. Okay, 30 minutes, oh my. All right, so just animating away. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll post this soon.